Hello, my name is Carl Money. I'm a Senior Analytical Manager for Mental Health within NHS England, and this is the third and final training session on the Mental Health Service Dataset, or the MHSDS. In session 1, we covered an introduction to the dataset. Session 2 was around the MHSDS as it is in the National Commissioning Data Repository, or NCDR. And session 3 is around querying the MHSDS. So we did a little bit of coding at the end of the second session, and we're going to look into that in much more detail in this session. As a prerequisite, you do need to have a fairly basic understanding of SQL. We don't do anything particularly complex here, but if you know your way around kind of select statements and grouping and aggregating, you'll be absolutely fine. Just to reiterate a message from the second training session, so if your extract came from the NHS Digital DARS service, so the Data Access Request Service, this session, like the second one, will be of very little use to you because the format and the nature of that extract is very, very different to the one that we receive in NHS England. So without further ado, so session 3, we're going to cover querying the monthly data. We're going to look at querying over multiple periods. We're going to talk really importantly around suppression and data sharing. And then there are some further resources we can link you to have a look at more examples of code, more logic, those kind of things. So moving on to querying monthly data. This is by far and away the simplest analysis from the MHSDS because it works with the monthly chunks of data that are in the MHSDS. So you remember from the first training session around how if a referral is open for 12 months, there will be 12 records of it in the data set. So by looking at each month individually, it's much more straightforward. This forms the bulk of the analysis that my team produce. Primarily because our customers, so policy teams, etc., like to have time series information, but it's also much more transparent as well because the codes are much simpler to read. So we're going to skip back to the query we had at the end of the second training session. So this very much looked at the number of referrals grouped by month ID and the distinct count of people as well. So we were looking where the service discharge date is null or after the reporting period end date. So we were only interested in those referrals that are still open. And we grouped and ordered by the unique month ID. So this is really handy at a national level, but there's tons more that we may want to drill down into. We can, for example, fairly simply add in the org ID provider field. So this is the submitter, if you like, of the data. So we've added it, as you can see, into the select statement. I've also added it into our group by clause. So one of the really important things to stress at this stage is that because we've brought in another field, in this case, the org ID provider, in many cases that will impact our distinct people count. And that's because a person can appear across multiple providers. So because we're now grouping by provider, it will treat each of those people as a distinct entity. So if we were to add up all of our provider totals, that will be a lot higher than we can see if we were to look at it nationally without that provider in there. And that's the same with things like demographics and CCG, which we'll come on to later. So that's a really important kind of point to note, that because a person can be seen within multiple providers and the data for that person, more importantly, can be different between those providers. It's just important to kind of flag that now. So yeah, those totals will be higher than our national total. So I talked about adding in kind of CCG, and we can do that again kind of fairly simply by adjoining our MPI table using the record number field. So again, the record number is linked to that person in that particular submission, so that provider month combination. And that allows us to bring through data from the MPI. So in this case, we've got the org ID CCG res. We've added that to our group by, and in this case, I've also added it to the order by as well. And again, because we've added in CCG and for whatever reason, across providers, people maybe have, in this case, different postcodes, which is where the org ID CCG residence is derived from. That would then impact our coding because a person may be counted across multiple CCGs, or they may not know the person's postcode if they, for example, attended in crisis. So that field would be left blank, but then again, we'd count them twice, once in their actual CCG, once against that null value, if you like. So we've got a link to the MPI table, so we can then kind of do much more with that as well. So here I've added in the age. In this case, I've chosen the age at the service referral request received date, so the age at the time that referral was received by the provider. Then I've also added in the ethnic category as well, and again for similar reasons, less so on the referral, but in terms of the person's ethnic category, that again may differ between providers. So just something to bear in mind that again, our person counts will increase as we add in more of this kind of information. And again, that's taken from the MPI table, so we didn't need to add an additional join there. We can take that even further as well. So our next join is to add in the 102 table. So that's the service or team type referred to. While most referrals in the MHSDS have a one-to-one relationship between the 101 and the 102 table, so a referral is to a specific team. In some cases, a referral may include working with multiple teams, and the way that provider has flowed that is there are multiple 102 records to that referral table. That is allowed within the dataset, but in most cases it is a one-to-one relationship between the 101 and 102 table. So you see here I've joined on I've created the join. It's a left join because not every record would have this information. I've given it a pseudonym of S, and I've joined it on record number, and in this case also unique service request ID, again because a person may have more than one referral. You see I've added it into the select statement and also added it to the group by. So what we have now is a fairly complicated query where we can see the number of referrals and the number of people in each CCG by age, ethnic category, and the type of service that they've accessed. We can then kind of split that down or look at specific areas by adding more statements into our where clause. So if you want to look at specific teams or specific CCGs, specific ethnicities, you can limit our output by adding that into our where clause if you like. So hopefully that's been helpful. It's shown you a couple of joins and also talks you through kind of adding in some of the ethnic data, ethnicity data, ages, but also some of the pitfalls in doing that as well, particularly when we count people. So that's a look at querying monthly data. So we're going to look now at querying data over multiple periods. And this is a little bit trickier, as I said, because of the nature of the MHSDS, where we have kind of monthly cuts of data, so that there are multiple instances of a thing as you look over multiple periods. So it is a little bit more challenging, and not only is it challenging because that data is duplicated over months, the data can change between months as well. So referrals may have their start date changed. People's demographics can be updated, particularly as more is known about that person. So the best way to do this is to identify the latest record and go from there. So in the next slide, we're going to look at hospital spells. So we're going to look at admissions and discharges over a 3-month period. So what we've done here is we start with our 501 hospital spell table. We've added an inner join to our submission flag, so we get the right data. In this case, we're looking at the latest data again. We've limited it to month ID between 1462 and 1464, so that's January to March 2022. So we've got a couple of data items, a couple of fields from the hospital spell table, which is that H pseudo. We've got the reporting period start and end date from our flags table as well. And then you'll see now there we've added in a partition or a row number. And this is a really handy bit of code that assigns a number based on the partition. So here we're saying for each person, service request ID and hospital spell ID, order it by unique month ID. And in this case, we're going for descending. So if a person has 3 hospital spell records, one for each month, it would order them by the latest month ID downwards. So we would then get our latest record would have a row number of 1 because we've ordered the month ID by descending, and it will do that for each individual combination of person, hospital spell, and referral. So it's really, really handy in this case. So once we've done that, we're going to dump it into a temporary table, which I've called hosp order. Obviously, temporary tables are great, but if it is a large table, so more than a couple of thousand or tens of thousand rows, think about bringing it into your sandbox or another place just to kind of speed up the server. So once we've got the data in our temporary table, we can then have a look at pulling some data out. So here, we're taking it from our hospital order temp table. We've given that a pseudonym of H. And in the where clause, we're saying where derived hospital spell order, so that's the name that I've given our row number field, is 1. So because we're ordering by month ID descending, that gives us the latest record for that particular hospital spell, split by person, referral, and hospital spell ID. So what we can see is that I've done a couple of sum and a couple of count statements. So the first aggregate step is to look at where the hospital spell starts between the report period start and end date, and that's I've called admissions. I've done something similar. So I've done a count distinct. So when the hospital spell starts between the reporting period start and end date, then count the derived person ID. So again, a person may be admitted more than once, so we can see the number of admissions and also the number of people admitted. I've done the same thing, but looking at discharges. So where the discharge date in this first and in the third aggregate statement, sorry, when the discharge date is between hospital spell start and the reporting period, sorry, start and end date, then give it a 1 else 0, that's discharges, and then again account distinct where the discharge date is between the reporting period start and end date, then count the person ID. And that's really important because if we were to count admissions in each month and then add them up, it may be that that date has changed. So that's why we need to take that latest record to make sure that we're reflecting that and as accurately as possible, because we're looking over multiple periods now. So once we have that, we can add in again some more demographic information. So we've inner joined the MPI on the record number, and we don't need to prioritize that record because we have the record number, which would only link that latest hospital spell back to the MPI table, which is absolutely fine. And you notice then we also don't need to use the flags table either, because we did that step within the hospital spell temporary table creation step as well. So because the record number is specific to a submission, we know that we'll be picking the right submission as well. So you see we've added in the ethnic category, org ID, and CCG. You'll notice I haven't added in the group by clause, but you would need to do that, add in that group by step. And this again kind of breaks down so we can see admissions, people admitted, discharges, people discharged by ethnic category, provider, and CCG residents there. So again, so as I said, querying over multiple time periods is tricky because the data does change, but by using that row number, it is a really helpful kind of tool, and it's quite efficient as well in terms of coding. Go. So suppression and data sharing. So this is probably the most important part of the presentation, but there is only one slide on it, you'll be pleased to hear. So small number suppression must be applied where data leaves NHS England, and that's part of our data sharing agreement with NHS Digital, and that's to stop the identification of individual people. So the data sharing agreement does talk about it leaving NHS England, but I would strongly advise that all data has small number suppression applied, and that's because if you were to put some data in a spreadsheet, email it to somebody, you've now lost control of where that spreadsheet goes, and you can make it as clear as possible that the data can't leave NHS England without being suppressed, but that may happen. So I'd strongly advise that all data has that small number suppression applied. And in the MHSDS, the suppression rules are at England level. Data can be unrounded and unsuppressed. That's absolutely fine. But at any kind of lower level geography, so region, STP, ICB, CCG or sub ICB, or whatever the calling is nowadays, provider, all values between 0 and 4 are suppressed. So that 0 is really important as well. If you have a 0 value, that also needs to be suppressed. You can't put it 0. So everything between 0 and 4 is suppressed. All of the other values are rounded to the nearest 5, and that's to stop what's called people picking up a total column or an England figure, then adding up the provider totals, for example. If you have only one suppressed value, you can then work out very easily what that suppressed value is. So by rounding all of the other values, it kind of automates that step rather than using secondary suppression, which is fairly manual and is prone to error. So that's why we round all of the other values to nearest 5 as well at that sub-England level. Cool. Further resources then. So all of the code that drives any of NHS England's MHSDS reporting, so the stuff from my team, is on our GitHub page. NHS Digital also have a metadata file. There is some code in there, but it is more plain English descriptions and things, but it's helpful to kind of understand the logic, particularly as you try to replicate some analysis from NHS Digital. And then I think this was in the first set of training slides, but the link to the NHS Digital Dataset Guides and Specs. So there'll be a document there called the Technical Output Specification. It's an Excel document. It is by far and away the most useful thing to look at when you're using the MHSDS, because it includes every single field, derivations included as well. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time.